Hi, I'm Ashley, and today we're going to talk about different brush strokes that we can use for our watercolor paintings. So before we jump in, I do want to say that I always forget to ask for any sort of engagement while I'm actually doing the thing. So if at any point during this video you have questions, leave them in the comments. If you want to tell me your favorite technique or your favorite brush stroke, let me know. And if you like the video or it's helpful, give it a like and check out my channel and subscribe for tons more content. Thanks so much. Let's jump into the brush strokes. So the camera cut out, but it didn't miss much. Just introducing the first brush stroke. So the first brush stroke is the thin line stroke. And so I just take my brush and load it with a lot of water and paint. And then now we're gonna pick up where it cut out. Very vertically here. So I'm not gonna lay it flat. I'm just gonna hold it upright and then with a very light touch, just do a thin line. And sometimes it helps to kind of anchor part of your hand down if you're trying to do a straight line, but you can get very thin lines with even a decent size. This is size 14 round. So it's a decent size brush and you can get very thin lines using the point of the brush. Okay, the opposite of that would be a thick line stroke. So instead of using the tip of the brush, I'm gonna lay it at an angle, so about a 45-degree angle, and I'm gonna press down and do a thick line. Okay. So you can go from thin to thick. Another variation is a tapered stroke. So I can start thin and then slowly add more pressure, pushing down to the belly of the brush to make it thicker. Or, you can do the opposite. Start thicker and lift off to taper it down to a thin line. Okay, so those are tapered strokes. A version of a tapered stroke is a calligraphy or calligraphic stroke. So you can change the pressure for different patterns and lettering. So if I'm going to do a B, right? So I can change the pressure from light to heavy to light to heavy and get those varied strokes. So it's like the tapered stroke, but specific for lettering or different specific shapes. If you look up different styles of watercolor, especially like Chinese watercolors or ink and wash, they use a lot of calligraphic or calligraphy type lines in their artwork. And it's really beautiful and very controlled. It's pretty amazing. Okay, another version of this would be a ripple stroke, which is basically the same thing, but not necessarily for a specific letter or pattern. So I'm just going from thin to thick to thin to thick to get those kind of rippled effects. Okay, and if you use a different brush, you're going to get a different result. So if I take that liner brush, the very thin brush, and do the ripple, I'm going to start thin and then press down for thick, thin and thick. And you can see that it's not nearly as thick and the thin parts are about the same really. So that goes to show that a good point on a round brush really does help, but you can do that. And then, the calligraphy strokes with a thin liner brush are a little bit easier if you're good at calligraphy. I'm terrible at calligraphy, so I always kind of fake it and go back and thicken the lines later. But you can get good at it if you practice. Okay, so those are different, altering the pressure. So there are other strokes that are similar to the taper strokes that you'll hear a lot, especially with floral painting. So you can have a press and lift stroke. So I'm just going to press down and then lift off. Okay. And that can create petal shapes. And then if you take that a step farther, you can do a press, drag, and lift to create leaf or petal shapes as well. So again, that's press, drag, and lift. And the slower you lift, the more pointed the end is going to be. The faster you lift, the more blunt the end is going to be. So depending on what you're looking for. Okay, so that's press and lift here. And then these are two versions of press, drag, and lift. Another stroke that you're going to see is a C stroke or a C curve. So those can start with just the tip of the brush and be really thin strokes in the shape of a C or a backward C. Okay. Or you can do a C stroke with your press, drag, and lift, and you're just curving it in the shape of a C. Okay, that's a C stroke, and it can go either direction. And then you can have an S curve or an S stroke, which is going to have a curve one way and then a curve the other. Okay, so that's an S stroke. And you can add as many curves as you want with it, but there's your S stroke. Okay, another stroke that we can do that's kind of calligraphy inspired is a loop stroke. So you can hold the brush vertical and make little loops. So this is good for circles or for like figure eights or just little swirls. So it can be for like little vines on a plant. You can do little loops. Okay. If you press harder, you're going to get some variety in line weight. So that's another version of kind of a calligraphy stroke. Okay, now we can kind of combine things here. So I'm going to do a C stroke, but we're going to combine that with a rolling stroke. So I'm going to actually roll the brush between my fingers while I'm making that C stroke. Okay, so I start with my light pressure, and then as I'm making the curve around, I'm twisting or rolling the brush in my fingers. So if I am going, let's see, this is counterclockwise, then I'm going to roll the brush in that same direction. This was what happened if I rolled it in the opposite direction. So I'm trying to make the curve clockwise, but I'm trying to roll counterclockwise, and it makes these shapes. So it's something to play with. That's not necessarily a bad shape, but it might not work for what you're going for. So if I'm going to make the curve this way, clockwise, then I need to roll my brush clockwise and get a much smoother shape. Okay, so if you do that, you can see the bristles fan out more and make kind of a thicker mark versus just the C stroke where they don't fan out as much. So it's a different technique that you can incorporate into all of your strokes. Okay, so that's isolated really to fingers, the rolling is. Now you can also kind of twist your brush, which would be a larger movement. So you kind of combine the roll, and then you're also kind of twisting your brush around. And if I twist that brush around, I can make these sharper curves. So I'm actually twisting it around and making these sharper moves. That's kind of a cool texture on that one. So another kind of variation, it's twist is a little bit more like your whole arm moving in a bigger motion versus rolling is just in your fingers. Okay, so a couple other kind of things that you can use. You can use parallel lines to create shading and texture. So it's something that you can practice. Just the thin tip of my brush here, very light pressure. So again, we're back to that vertical hold. And so those parallel lines can be very close together, or they can be farther apart. And if you layer them very close together, you're going to get like a denser, darker feel, darker value, versus farther apart. It's going to feel like a lot lighter and airier. Okay, so that's parallel lines. Then you can do cross-hatching. Okay, so cross-hatching uses parallel lines. So I'm going to start with parallel lines angling up. Okay. And then I can cross-hatch, which is going directly perpendicular. So my angle was from bottom left to top right. Now I'm going to go from top left to bottom right and do lines like this. Okay, that's cross-hatching. And again, the more densely packed the cross-hatching, the darker the value. So this is a sketching technique used, with ink and pencils, but you can use it with watercolor as well. Now I'm doing it with all of it wet. I'm not waiting till it dries. So it's really bleeding in and making this a very dark value. And then this would be a lighter value, like lighter shading. So it's something that you can kind of incorporate from your sketching techniques, but use watercolor and create similar effects, which is kind of cool, combining those different techniques and effects. Okay, another technique that we can use is dry brushing. So dry brushing is a bit of a misnomer. So the brush doesn't actually have to be dry to do dry brushing. You can see, again, I have a lot of water in this well, a lot of paint, okay? So I'm taking that, and my brush is pretty loaded right now. I'm not dabbing it on the page. So it's gonna be harder to do dry brushing like that, but you can. So I'm gonna show you this first and then show you with dabbing, okay? So the key to dry brushing is a very flat hold. So I am holding my brush almost flat against the page, okay? And then I'm just barely going to touch the page. So super, super light pressure. And I'm just grazing the edge. See, I pushed too hard. Grazing the edge here, okay? And quicker is easier with dry brushing, because if you go slower, it's harder to keep that light pressure. So this was me trying to go slow. This was faster, okay? So you can see that broken dry brush texture, but this was with a lot of water on the brush. So you still have areas or sections that are more coverage, especially like here, when I tried to go slow, it didn't work at all. So now I'm gonna load that brush up, and instead of going straight to the page, I'm gonna dab it on my towel to take off extra water. So there's still paint in my brush. Now I'm gonna go here and same hold, almost flat to the page. And then I'm just gonna quickly run that brush across the page, okay? So way more white space there, way more broken. If I press harder, I can get more coverage. This is very little water on the brush now though, okay? So you see, I still didn't get that much coverage. If you want it to be darker value, take thicker paint, and then you can do the same thing, but with darker value. To lighten the value, like I just showed, you can add a ton of water into your palette, right? So this is gonna be a very light value purple. Load it up, dab off that extra water, and then come in and dry brush. So you can still have a lot of water in your palette, but achieve dry brushing, okay? Next is a feather stroke, and this is similar to dry brushing in the sense of you're trying to get some broken effects, but you don't have to be as flat to the page. So I'm still gonna take that color, I'm gonna add a little bit more darkness so it's easier to see, but still lots of water, okay? Dab off the excess, and I'm gonna hold now more vertical, and I'm just gonna kind of feather it up. And if your bristles kind of get this broken up appearance, that's going to be easier to get more texture. So it's similar to your dry brushing, but you don't have to have that flat hold. So this is good for like grasses, foliage, things like that. Okay. So that's, or feathers. I mean, it's called the feather stroke. Okay. So the next one is scumbling, which is another way to get texture. So I'm going to take some paint. Again, I'm going to dab off some of the excess water. And for scumbling, you actually are going to do like a scrubbing motion. So again, this is another version of kind of dry brushing, but it's not technically the same thing. And again, I'm not going to have that flat hold. I'm going to have it up. It can be kind of at whatever angle you want, but you're actually going to scrub and press that brush down and just kind of scrub it around. Okay. And so this is a way, if you take off a ton of that paint, you can get really interesting textures. You can kind of take some wet paint that's already on there and scrub it around. Okay, that's scumbling. All right, now a teardrop stroke is going to be similar to our press and lift stroke. So this works really well with a round brush because it's already the right shape. Okay, but a teardrop stroke is going to be rounded at one end and then tapered to a point at the other. So the easiest way to do that is basically your press and lift. So I'm going to take the point and then drag, and then on the end I'm going to kind of twist, not that much, to make a teardrop. Okay, so press and drag, and I want that end to be rounded versus our press and lift is more of this blunt flat end. So if I want that end to be rounded, I have to kind of add that twist in. So press and then twist off at the end. And there you have a nice teardrop shape. Okay. Dabbing stroke is going to get a similar effect to, again, your press and lift, but it can be various amounts of pressure. So dabbing can be really small amounts of pressure, so you get these little like dots, or it can be heavier pressure. Okay, so that kind of looks like the inside of a dahlia. Okay, so it's good for that, or different textures on buildings, or wherever. Depends on what you're painting, what you're going to use these strokes for, but that to me looks like the inside of a mum or a dahlia. So that's dabbing. Stippling is going to be similar to dabbing, but it's specifically very small dots. So this is going to be another vertical hold, and we're just going to do small dots. And this is another technique that's used in pencil and ink, where the closer you put the dots together, the more dark the value is going to feel. And then the more that you spread those dots out, the lighter the value feels. So if you're doing, I don't do a lot of florals, but the easiest way to think about it a lot of times is in kind of floral paintings. If this is the center of a flower, this is your bright side and this is your shaded side. And you can see that already, that gives you that effect without doing anything else. So if you're going for loose, like impressionistic flowers, that's a good technique. So that's called stippling. Okay, splattering. It's not exactly a brush stroke, but it's fun and it's effective. So with splattering, you're going to get a decent amount of paint and water on your brush. I'm going to cover some of these areas because I just want it to be on the very end here. So I don't want to get this splatter all over the rest of the page. So just this corner. And I'm going to tap my brush and create splatters. Some brushes, the paint and water want to stay in the brush more than others. So the softer your brush is, kind of the bigger the splatters are going to be because it won't release as easy. But if you get a stiffer brush, so like this one is a stiffer synthetic brush, then it's going to be easier to release the splatters than even this one, because this holds a little bit more water. With brushes that it's easier to release the splatters, like stiffer brushes, you can even just kind of tap with the same hand. Okay, so that's splattering. You can splatter into a wet area also. So I'm going to wet this little area of the page and then take some of the paint and splatter into that. And you can see that you get diffusion. So just different techniques. Okay. Another similar technique to splatter would be flicking. So you can take the brush and actually flick it, and that's going to get you even finer dots, because that it doesn't aerosolize the paint, but that's kind of what I'm picturing. So it allows those that water tension to release easier because you're forcing it more. And so you get finer splatters that way by flicking than you do by splattering. Okay. And you can do this with a varying amount of water. So if you take thicker paint and then splatter, it's going to get smaller dots as well, versus having a ton of water, you're going to get bigger splatters. So just different kind of variations of splattering, but that's all splattering and flicking. Okay, another stroke that you can do is a fan stroke. So you can actually spread the bristles out on your brush to make them look like a fan. If you have a fan brush, you can use that too. Usually fan brushes are pretty stiff. They don't hold a ton of water, and they have like a pretty distinct angle to them. So just play with it if you're going to use a fan brush. A lot of people like to use them for like trees and stuff, but I find that I get these weird like curved lines with them because I don't use them very well. So a fan brush or a fan stroke, I'm going to take some paint, I'm going to spread the bristles out, and then I'm just going to lightly sweep that across the page to get a textured effect. So this is similar to the feather stroke, but you're intentionally kind of spreading out those bristles and getting more of that stripey look to it. Okay, lifted stroke or lifting is another type of brush stroke that I don't know if you can really consider it brush stroke, but it is. It can be. And you're actually going to lift color off of the page. So I'm going to come down here where this is still wet. Okay. So I'm just going to dab off the brush so it's cleanish. Let me clean it better. Yeah. Okay. It's a clean brush. Dab it off so it's very minimally damp. And then I'm going to lift that paint off the page. Okay, so you can lift that way. Or if it's already dry, you can add some water and lift away some of the paint. So this purple is pretty staining, so it's not lifting much. This is Windsor Violet, by the way, in case you're wondering. It's a pretty purple, but some colors are going to lift easier than others. Windsor Violet's fairly staining, but you can still see I am lightening up and softening this edge a little bit. So that's lifting. Okay, you can kind of scrub out the paint and then pull it off. You can also lift with a towel and dab off paint. So if you catch it while it's still wet, it's going to lift off a lot easier for the most part than if you're trying to lift later. Some colors are going to lift easier than others though, but that's lifting. Okay, layering is where you apply a color, you let it dry, and then you paint over it with another transparent layer. And that's going to affect the color. So I'm going to do this with another transparent layer of the same color. Okay, so this is the same purple. And I'm just getting a lot of water and paint in the brush, dab off the extra. Now I'm going to take that and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to layer over. Okay, so this is layering with the same color, and you can see that the layered part, even with the same color, is going to be darker value than the non-layered part. So you can adjust values by layering and make it darker, or you can adjust the color or the color temperature. So if I wanted to create a new color, so if I'm going to mix purple with, let's mix purple and yellow because they're contrasting. Okay, so I'm going to take some yellow here, make sure it's got enough water. Okay, and then now I'm going to layer over this with yellow, and you're going to see that I create a new color. It's kind of brown, okay, because purple and yellow make brown. So that's called optical mixing, where we didn't actually mix the colors, but our eye mixes them on the page because they're layered. So we're seeing both those colors and they're mixing to our eye. So you can actually change the color that way, or you can change the temperature of the color. So let's say this purple, we wanted it to be a little bit more blue. So I'm going to just take some blue. I'm going to take, that's not the blue that I wanted. I'm going to take some ultramarine. Okay, dab off the extra water, and I'm going to layer the ultramarine over the purple. Okay, and that makes the purple more blue versus this, which is like a more pinky purple. Okay, so you can change the color temperature, you can change the actual color, and you can change the value. So layering is a very important technique in watercolor if you're going to do more detailed paintings, and if you're going to do multiple layers, you need to know kind of the consistency of the paint and to not use too many brush strokes where you're actually lifting and altering the layer underneath. So that's layering. Then you have a double loaded brush stroke. So I'm going to take a flat brush for this. Actually, I'm going to do a filbert. And you can double load your paintbrush, and that means that you take two different colors. So I'm going to take one side and get purple, and then the other side I'm going to get my ultramarine because it's already awake. And then you can do a brush stroke where it is double loaded. So it's purple on one side, blue on the other. Okay, and when you do that, the colors naturally blend together, and it's like a seamless transition versus trying to lay those two colors next to each other. So I just kind of added a little bit more blue. I'm going to do now kind of a press. I'm going to do a C stroke with a twist, or with a rolling it. Okay, so if I do that, okay, and you can see I don't have a lot of water on the brush, but that's okay. Let's get that double loaded again. But you can see that transition again. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of go over this part now. And there's a very, very opaque version. Okay, and you have that transition from the purple to the blue very naturally. Okay, that's a ton of water on it. Okay, and then I could do some lifting and lift off some of that color, right? Lift off some of the paint and reveal that transition even in this darker part a little bit more, right? So it's just kind of a fun thing to play with, and you don't need to worry about your palette getting messed up or messy, because even if you mix the colors, first of all, it's not a huge deal for most paintings if your colors aren't exactly pure. But if you have a painting where you need the colors to be more their original, let's take my yellow ochre here. You see all this green in here? It's not that big of a deal. I can just go in and clean it up with a clean brush, clean wet brush, okay? And I cleaned out all that green. Now, I don't like to waste that paint, so you could just rinse it off. but I kind of put it in my palette and then I let that dry, and I come back and use these later for shadows, because shadows tend to be more colors mixed together anyway, so it's not a big deal if they're a little bit muddy. So I use all of these colors again, but it's very easy to clean up the wells even if you mix some paints in there. So don't worry about that. All right. Thank you so much for watching this brushstroke video. If you enjoyed it, again, give it a like and check out my channel for tons more content. Thanks so much for watching. Have an awesome day. Bye.